naturopathic doctor and an osteopathic manual practitioner. Back in the day, I used to be a registered massage therapist, and I'm currently working on a PhD in integrated medicine. So I kind of really interested in all this stuff for a long time, and one thing just keeps leading into another, and the more I get immersed in this world, the more I find it that much more interesting, and just want to keep learning the next pieces that make everything kind of click together. So Janice asked me to do a talk for you guys today. So I thought for a group of walkers/runners, one of the things I see way too often is a lot of injuries. So, well, these are the key. Everybody wants to know, how do you burn fat properly? Because even when people exercise, I don't know about you, but I think it's probably one of the most frustrating things when you exercise lots and it's still hard to burn fat, which often we want to do. And the thing I like talking about with burning fat and fat loss is that when you do it properly, it's actually your entire body gets much better. Like holistically, everything in your body generally improves when you're doing it properly and effectively. There's a big difference between improper and proper kind of weight loss, which we'll chat about. And one of the side benefits is that when you're doing all this kind of stuff, you really do prevent your risk of long-term chronic disease, of basically everything under the sun. So sound interesting? All right, so I'm going to break this down into two sections. We're going to do a little bit on nutrition, and then we're going to do a little bit on exercise. I'm going to break down what I think are some of the most important pieces to really pull all of this stuff together. And what I'm teaching you is pretty much exactly what I incorporate into my life too on a pretty regular basis now. I've tried lots of different stuff around nutrition. Being a naturopathic doctor, you go through just about every diet possible. What I currently do, I still think, is probably one of the best things that I've done personally, and I find really good results with most of my patients. When you are eating correctly and exercising correctly, we should be able to manage inflammation effectively. We should be able to optimize our nervous system, meaning we spend more time in that rest and digest part of the nervous system rather than that fight or flight stress part of the nervous system. And we should be able, when those things are working well, we should be able to burn fat fairly effectively. We're naturally supposed to be in those states. We more unnaturally fall out of those states. If you were to look back in the day, how much time we would have actually spent, say, in rest and digest versus fight or flight. Fight or flight is kind of designed for when you need to go and catch an animal and eat it, or when you're running away from an animal because it's going to eat you, or something along those lines, or you're going to war, or something along those types of things. The vast majority of time should have been spent resting, relaxing, socializing. It shouldn't have been a big stressful event. But in today's world, that seems to be all the time now. I mean, people can get texts, and as soon as the text comes on, you're already kind of get a bit of a jolt, depending on who the text is coming from. So when you can manage those things through diet and exercise, even outside of all of the other important stuff like mindfulness training and stress management, all these kind of things. Probably one of the most stressful things we can do to our body is how we're eating on a regular basis. So if we look at diet and nutrition foundations, first thing I generally think is, if you've never done it before, try and remove some of the most common allergenic foods. I cannot tell you how many times when people remove certain foods that tend to be sensitive for them, so many symptoms just start to clear up. They don't have to be a full-blown allergic reaction like you would have to something like shellfish, right? Or when we think of peanuts in that way, where you get this big scary hives and anaphylaxis type of reaction, you have to carry an EpiPen around with you. People can have those, but outside of that, I'm talking about different types of more intolerance or sensitivity reactions that we just see all the time. And when people have them, they create a lot of inflammation. I'll explain how that works in just a bit, and I'll go through what the top 6 are. We need to decrease bad oils. So when I say bad oils, what comes to mind for you? Trans fats, absolutely. Saturated fats, depending. That's a good one that came up, and I'll explain that more too. Think vegetable oils. Just about every single vegetable oil you eat is already gone rancid and has been broken down and oxidized through its processing. So when we look at safflower oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, soy oil, all of those things, I would throw them out. If you've got them in your house, get rid of them. I wouldn't use them. And I'll explain what the good oils are and sort of how that happens, okay? And the next part is to become fat adapted. So has anybody heard that term, fat adapted? What this means is that, and this sounds like a really good idea anyways, when you think about it, it's training the body so that it uses fat effectively as a fuel source. Because most people do not effectively burn fat as a fuel source. We're actually stuck in a process where our body preferentially prefers to burn sugars. And so if we are burning sugars, that means that we are primarily burning carbohydrates and then proteins, because carbohydrates and proteins both break down into sugars. And that's what the body primarily likes to use. Depending on how we exercise, we will decide if we are going to primarily burn fats or if we're going to primarily burn sugars. Depending on how we are eating and the types of ratios of foods we have, we will burn more fats or more sugars. Vast majority of people have trained their bodies to be very effective at burning sugars, and as a consequence, it has almost shut down our ability to adequately access fat as a fuel source. So we're going to talk about how you do that, and we need to increase good fats. We need to substantially lower a lot of the carbs, and particularly refined carbs and whatnot. Some of the stuff you've probably heard before. The problem is that too many carbs lock you in a pattern of fat storage. And there's been a lot of information that's gone over the last probably 6 decades. And a lot of it has been absolutely horrible information. And they're almost debunking a lot of what they have said for so long. And it's actually created a diabetic epidemic. It's made tons of heart disease and cancer rampant. And a lot of it is related to all of these problems that they started with a long time ago that they thought was good for us. And incorporating periods of intermittent fasting. Has anybody ever heard of this, intermittent fasting, and what that is? Okay, well, we'll talk about that one in a bit too. That's actually one of my favorite hacks for quickly burning fat. And I'll show you a trick that substantially cuts down cravings for sugars and whatnot. And actually, I have not come across anything that I think works that as well as that does to cut down sugars. Cut down cravings for sugars. I just had somebody else do this a while ago. They're like, I don't know, I did this, and I actually didn't even feel like I needed to eat until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He wasn't even trying, and he had lost 6.5 kilograms in about a month.
The key word there is heat.
Yeah.
Men have no trouble with this. No.
Depends.
Okay.
Hormonally, women have much other things to look into, but the basics of it are still the same. And most of the women do quite well on it too. They have to tweak it a little bit though. So when we talk about food allergies, so food intolerances and gut inflammation. So what I'm showing you here is this, all these cells here, this is your gut lining. Your gut lining is basically one cell thick, and they're all meshed together like this. A healthy gut lining should be completely stuck together. Nothing should get through those gaps. Okay, what should happen is we should digest all of our food, and then it should be broken down. So say these were proteins. Proteins are really the problem, and I'm not talking proteins like a big steak or something like that, but we have little protein markers on just about every food that we have. Vegetables, fruits, carbohydrates, proteins. The only thing that doesn't is fats, and that's why fats generally are very non-reactive for most people as far as creating inflammation, creating an allergic reaction to it. If you are eating different foods, and say these are proteins, normally they should get here, they should be broken down into amino acids. Then amino acids can diffuse across here, they come into the bloodstream, and our body knows what to do with amino acids. It makes proteins, and it makes building blocks for all these different processes that we need in our body. The problem is that if we have gone over years of having a standard American diet, if we've had lots of antibiotics, if we've had lots of stress, if we've had sensitive foods that we didn't really realize we were sensitive to, we start to create inflammation in here. Once we create inflammation, what happens is these little guys here, called these tight junctions, that hold these cells together, start to weaken, and then we get little bits of splaying that happens. When that starts to happen, we get gaps in this junction that should normally not have gaps in it. So then what happens? We eat our meal. These proteins, before they get a chance to be broken down into amino acids, sneak across the gap here. Once a whole protein or a partial protein it gets absorbed into the bloodstream, our body looks at that and it's kind of like, what the heck is that? It looks at it no different than if it was a foreign bacteria or a virus. It looks at it, says that's foreign, creates antibodies to it, and then every time we eat that food, if it's not digesting and it's sneaking across here, every time it gets there, it creates an inflammatory reaction. So for this could be for anybody, and the sensitivities, the symptoms that we get from food sensitivities can be anything under the sun. So it can be from, has anybody ever eaten a meal and the next morning they feel like they've just got a layer of fluid all through their skin and any definition just seems like it's a little bit less than what it was before? Or do you wake up and find that your rings feel a little bit heavier or a little bit tighter and clothes fit and the belly kind of comes over a little bit more? That's almost always inflammation. It's not fat accumulation because it goes away fairly quickly when you stop certain foods. That's part of what this inflammatory reaction is like. Other things that can happen could be people could get chronic inflammation where they're getting rheumatoid arthritis symptoms. They get chronic breakdown. They run into chronic strain sprain injuries over and over and over again. They could get migraine headaches. They could have chronic digestive issues. They could have constipation, diarrhea, PMS. It could be anything under the sun. Most of it all stems from inflammation. So when I look at food sensitivities, I think of that as a potential big log in the fire that if it's there, we need to pull it out just to see what we can get back to normal is. That make sense? So these are the top 6 that I generally look at. There's others, but these would be the big ones that I would say do probably 90 to 95% of the damage for most people. Has anybody ever tried taking gluten or dairy out? Yeah. I can almost guarantee you, once you get over the withdrawal period, because you will go through a bit of a withdrawal period, they actually show now that many foods have an addiction not much different than most drugs do. Sugar being right up there at one of the top ones. But gluten and dairy, both the proteins, the gluten and the casein protein in dairy, have an almost morphine-like conversion. They can create glutinomorphins and caseinomorphins, and they actually have an opiate-like effect on the body and create a very strong addiction. When people take those out, often find tons of different changes happen. You've got, for kids, I'll see this where they come in if they've got, now I'll have my clinic downtown's a big pediatric clinic, so we see a lot of kids, right from even a week old. And if I start to see kids that are having eczema or reflux, or they start to get lots of ear infections, they've got chronic upper respiratory tract infections. Most of the time it's coming from a reaction to either a food that the mother is eating when they're breastfeeding, or to the formula that they're taking, or if they're introducing foods, it could be from one of those things. And you start to wean that out and you will see differences. I have a 1-year-old daughter, and when she started eating foods, we saw that right away. You challenge with stuff, and when you're watching and looking for it, you'd start to see, oh, she started to get a rough patch on her skin as soon as we introduce that. You take it out for a few days, disappears, put it back in, comes back up again. Doesn't mean they have to be gone for good, but you want to be aware of it and you want to know how things affect your body. Soy and corn are huge. They're probably the 2 most GMO'd foods that we have. It's almost impossible to get them non-GMO'd. And they're in everything. And soy is a really bad oil. If we eat soy in the way a Asian man or woman would eat it in Japan, then that's got some benefits to it. But that's primarily eating more fermented soy, not having it as soy protein powder and soy and the sort of pasteurized type of soy milk that we drink, and soy oil in everything. If you look at packaged foods, you will see soy oil and canola oil in almost everything. And they're probably 2 of the most inflammatory oils that we have. Peanuts. I like peanuts. I mean, I think most people like peanut butter. Peanuts tend to are one of the foods that is highest in certain mold toxins. There are certain foods that are generally across the board quite high in mold toxins. Peanuts are one of them. Coffee's another. Chocolate's another. Wine's another.
The good stuff. Stop.
I know. You can get better versions of it though. I still eat some chocolate. I still drink some coffee. You just get better versions that don't have mold in it. And I can tell you, you feel different when you do it. And then sugar and artificial sweeteners. Again, doesn't mean that I don't have sugar sometimes, but as a whole, you want to be aware of it. And what I think is good for everybody to do at some point is, if you can, take all of them out for a month. See how you feel after a month. And then try and bring them back in. And if you're sitting there going, oh my gosh, there's no way I could take that, you have an addiction. Absolutely, there's an addiction. If it scares you to think about, oh my gosh, there's no way I could go without cheese for a month, holy cow, you're addicted to cheese. And almost everybody is. But how they look at this is, think of each one of these as being like a tack. And sometimes we might take one food out, but we don't feel necessarily as good as we'd like to feel. Sometimes you might have several food sensitivities and you just don't even know what they are. So it'd be like sitting on 6 tacks. And maybe you take 3 of them out, but you're still sitting on 3 tacks, and it still kind of hurts. So it's like, take all of them out for a little while, see what it feels like, and then start adding them back in one at a time with a bit of a challenge period and see how you feel. You go for about a month without these and then have a day of eating a whole bunch of gluten and just see what your body feels like. It's the best way to challenge it and see what's really going on. You can only sort of tell yourself sometimes so often that I think I'm pretty good with them until you take them out and then challenge it and feel it. Good fats. These are pretty much the main fats that I think most people should have. Coconut oil. Has anybody heard of MCT oils? MCT oils are a medium chain triglyceride, MCT. They are what coconut oil is made. Coconut oil has about 11 different fats, but 4 of them are MCTs, and really 2 of them function primarily as MCTs. What's unique about these types of fats is that the type of chain they go right into the mitochondria as energy much faster than most other fats that have to digest in a certain way before they actually can be used as energy. So when you take MCTs, you give your brain a bit of a boost right away. And you also, your body starts to feel like you've got some energy, and they can tend to start to cut cravings down a little bit as well, because they raise something called ketones, is what happens when fats get burnt as energy. Grass-fed butter, very beneficial, but different than regular butter. You have to think of it like this. When we eat an animal that is healthy, that's eating healthy, then that animal is kind of healthy for us. If that animal is eating stuff that is making it unhealthy, then it's not so healthy for us. What is a cow's natural diet? Primarily grass. When it eats grass, it has substantially more omega-3s, which are anti-inflammatory. And it's got a much better omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, which is anti-inflammatory. When you have butter, or for that matter, animal fats, like from beef, for example, that is grass-fed versus grain-fed, they're completely different. Grass-fed butter has higher omega-3s. Non-grass-fed butter has much higher levels of omega-6s, which are inflammatory. Already, most people are way out of balance with omega-6s to 3s. Are people familiar with hearing those terms, omega-3 and omega-6? And butter has a high amount of butyrate, which is a type of fat that is very beneficial for the gut flora. So, has anybody heard a little bit about how important this gut microbiome is? That's a huge topic all on its own, but it interacts with just about every function that we can think of in the body. They actually think of it now just as important as like a liver or an intestine. It's no different. You have to think of it like a separate organ system with how much interaction it has with our body. Avocado and avocado oil. This is your best high cooking oil. So if you're going to be cooking at a higher temperature, that's the oil you want to use. Its smoke point is the highest out of all of them. Good quality nuts and seeds. So bad quality ones are going to get moldy very easily, and if they're exposed, generally oils, if they get exposed to heat, air, and light, they start to go bad. So you want to keep oils in a cool, darker place. With nuts and seeds, you want to keep your nuts and seeds sealed, keep them in the fridge, something along those lines, just to try and keep them from going bad. But when they're intact in the nut, their oils are way more stable than when we try to extract that out and just take it as an oil. The other one I would put here would be fish oils. Fish oils or krill oil, but some type of an omega-3 supplement, because when I test for that one in clinic, everybody I test for is out of balance with it. I have not seen one person, other than myself, I checked a while ago, but I take a fish oil very regularly. And probably if I didn't do that, it wouldn't have been balanced. Because I don't eat fish as much as I probably would need to keep it in, so I would take a fish oil to balance it out. So those are all the good fats. Is there anything surprising there for anybody? Any fats that you thought were healthy that aren't?
What about grapeseed oil?
Grapeseed oil would also be one raw. Olive oil raw too, right? So you don't want to be warming that oil up and heating it. It'll oxidize very quickly. Yeah. So drizzle it on your vegetables after, drizzle it on your salad. If you do a healthy stir fry where you might do it with water and steam it and then pour the oil on it after.
Why? What is using it to?
As soon as you heat an oil, it destabilizes the oil. The problem with most vegetable oils is that they are long fats. So they're long chain fats that have double bonds in them. And what happens is when you heat them, those double bonds break and then they become oxidized. So, or they turn into almost like a trans fat. So when I say oxidized, does everybody know what I mean by an antioxidant? So we take antioxidants to quench oxidized things. So we call those free radicals. And free radicals are like an oxidized oil. There was actually a conversation a while ago from some experts and they were saying, what do you think is more damaging to the body? Chronic smoking or taking unhealthy vegetable oils regularly? And they basically figured that the unhealthy oils was creating more damage than the smoking. You have to think of it every time you have that, it's having free radicals. That's what the problem with smoking is too. Okay? Those things are all related as carcinogens. They're all cancer promoting. They damage cells. That's what they do. And when you have lots of them, they deplete your natural stores of antioxidants because you're having to use them up all the time. Okay, becoming fat adapted. So when you want to do this, this is really how it has to work. And there's a couple of things that you can do. So first, you need to lower the amount of carbohydrates that you're eating. When we go to bed at night, so say we eat dinner at 6 o'clock. And then we don't eat anything on a good day. We don't eat anything until we go to bed. We go to bed, we wake up in the morning. Technically, we should have probably burned through our dinner. We should probably have burned through any storage carbohydrates that we had called glycogen. And if things are working well, when we wake up in the morning, we should probably be burning fats. If we did a blood ketone meter, we probably should see some ketones in our blood, meaning that we're burning fats as energy. As soon as we have carbohydrates or too much protein, right away we stop burning fats and we start burning carbohydrates and proteins. Our body is set up to preferentially want to burn carbohydrates and proteins before fats. Because if we were in a fight or flight state, sugars burn much faster and we get energy very quickly from them. So if we were in a fight or flight state, it is kind of wired that for survival, we need sugar to burn energy to get very quick, immediate energy. The problem is that we're not always in that state. And the other problem is that back in the day, we didn't used to have access to food on every corner. So we would naturally have to go through periods of scarcity, where we would have to go through fasting periods. We wouldn't be able to eat all day long. Or you'd be up in the morning and then foraging for food and then probably have a bigger meal later on in the day. So now that we have access to food all the time, the problem is that we actually are eating too often, and often too many carbohydrates or too many proteins, because proteins will get broken down to sugar too. If we are doing that too often, we are never giving our body a chance to burn stored fat. So what intermittent fasting does is it has people prolong the morning fast, totally opposite to what you would have heard. You need to get up and have a good breakfast right off the bat. Well, I can tell you that has been ingrained from probably the agriculture industry and the cereal makers and everything. Breakfast is the most important meal to get right. If you're going to have breakfast, you are much better off to have something like, say, eggs and vegetables. That would be a very beneficial meal to have where you're having a little bit of protein with some fat and maybe some avocado, a little bit more fat. What that would do is that allows your body to stay more in a fat-burning metabolism without switching it over into a different system where you're burning sugars. If you wake up in the morning and have cereal or a big bowl of oatmeal or something along those lines, that could be okay at times, but for the most part, you are not going to be burning fat. You will be burning all of that until that is done. Then you will go back to burning fat because that is the preferred fuel source. Does that make sense? So generally, when you're looking at this, you want to try and be below 150 carbs, and that's probably at the very high point. A lot of them would go right down lower and lower. Some would even say below 50 grams. But it depends ultimately on what do you need and what works for you. You know, no single person is exactly the same. So my general thought is, what do you need to do to get the results you want to do? And if you can do less and get away with it and you feel good, awesome. Like, you don't have to be a hero with it. If you need to do a little bit more and you feel good doing that, then see what works for you and works for your lifestyle. When you're looking at a macronutrients, and we're looking at fats, carbohydrates, protein, if you're breaking it up, the majority of the calories from your diet would be coming from fats, which would mean have more olive oil on your vegetables, have more coconut oil that you might stir fry things with lightly. Incorporate healthy fatty cuts of meat at times. Meats are fine if you're having good quality meats. If you're having pasture-raised, grass-fed meat, you can get a ton of omega-6s just like if you had wild salmon. So all of those things are fine. It's more just how we're getting it and if we're getting good quality sources that have a different ratio of good fats in them. So intermittent fasting, what I found is probably the best trick for that to continue fasting but not feeling hungry. Does anybody drink tea or coffee in the morning?
I drink a lot of green tea.
So either one of them you can do. So my favorite is I will have a coffee that's a mold-free coffee just because, and I wouldn't normally harp on that.
What is mold-free coffee? I thought coffee was coffee.
I
You mean
did
like
I
Tim
did
Hortons is
too.
not mold-free?
No, Tim Hortons would not be mold-free. They actually did a study. They found that about 50% of brewed coffee had mold toxins in it.
Okay, that's
So you might get one that's good, you might not. It's
right.
kind of like
It's
Russian
a
roulette.
Russian roulette.
It's rolling the dice each time. Some people aren't that sensitive to it, and if you're not, what generally the research would show is that it does create mitochondrial damage. Some people are just way more sensitive to it than others. They kind of think of it like the canary in the coal mine. Some people are just heightened sensitive, but it tells you, doesn't mean that the other people aren't being affected. They're just being affected first and worse.
So my question is, how do I know the difference?
So what you have to do, and when I first did it, I could have coffee about 4 days in a row, and then I would break out in acne.
Okay.
And so I just assumed I could not drink coffee. I was sensitive to caffeine or one of the other constituents in coffee. And then I learned a little bit more about one of this fellow who would make coffee, would call bulletproof coffee. And he had a similar problem. He had a lot of mold issues and everything. So then he ended up developing a way of making coffee, and then he lab tested to make sure that it's very low in mold toxins. So anyways, I tried that, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can drink coffee. Doesn't bug me at all. And I don't get the jittery ups and downs with it. Apparently a lot of those symptoms are actually from mold toxins, not just from caffeine. And so for me, if I have a cup of the coffee, and then what you do is you put key fats in it. Okay? Sounds funny, but trust me on it, it actually tastes really good. So what I would do is I would put, I'd blend my coffee, or I'd brew my coffee in like a Swiss water, or not a Swiss water, a French press. I'd pour it in the blender. I would add a tablespoon of a type of MCT oil that's specifically called brain octane because it turns into ketones the fastest and the most, which is what you want to shut down cravings. So I put about a tablespoon of that in. There's no flavor to it. And then I put in about half a tablespoon of grass-fed butter, and I put in a scoop of collagen protein. Collagen protein, if you are a walker or runner, if you have any types of aches or pains, is probably one of the most important building blocks for you to have. Anti-inflammatory protein that's the building block for all connective tissue. So I throw all that in. I usually add a little bit of cinnamon or a bit of vanilla or something, and then I blend the whole thing up. And it becomes this frothy, creamy kind of latte-like drink. Then I pour it in something like this, and then I drink it on my way to work. And then I have no problems after that of not really being hungry at all until probably dinner if I wanted to. But generally what you would do for an intermittent fast is that would be more of a breakfast, or you would do something like a couple of eggs and a bit of avocado and maybe some veggies. Something like that that's really primarily fats, okay? If you're doing primarily fats, you are not significantly pulling yourself out of that natural cycle that you are in the morning, which is burning fats, okay? So that's a great way, and what I found is I have not found anything that cuts sugar cravings as much as doing that. If you do that, you kind of really have almost no desire for food for quite some time. And what's nice is that you're not thinking about food. Thinking about food, if you're going through craving spikes up and down, is super tiring. It's like draining on your energy to be thinking about food all day long. So anyways, that was a huge one that I did. Healthy fats stabilize blood sugar and decrease inflammation. When you start to burn fats effectively, it's why you're not that hungry most of the time, because your blood sugar just evens right out. People can cure diabetes type 2 by doing a high-fat diet. Literally. Dr. His name will come to me. Created a diet that was basically for that purpose, and it was more or less this type of idea, probably about a 70% calorie-dense diet from very good fats. And they still had lots of others. It was Dr. Rosedale, the Rosedale diet. If you ever wanted to check that out, that does a whole bunch of that stuff. I find incorporating the intermittent fasting and then eating a higher fat-based diet, which might be like right now, because it's starting to get warmer, you might do like a salad with a chicken skewer or a beef skewer or something like that, and have some avocado on the side and maybe a bit of nuts and seeds on your salad. Something along those kind of lines would be moderate protein, high fat, low carbs, high vegetables. Okay? That kind of thing works really well. When you start to burn fats effectively, we lower a hormone called leptin. Leptin is a satiety hormone that is related to all sorts of problems, from diabetes and insulin resistance and all sorts of problems. When leptin starts to get lowered, it generally improves almost every biomarker for longevity and health that we have. So when we look at things like lowers blood sugars, we restore key hormones to youthful levels. You lower your cholesterol and blood lipid panels. It lowers fasting insulin levels. You lower your percent body fat. So about everything we can do starts to improve when we start to move into that direction. So burning fats effectively, what I say here, literally makes you superhuman. Because when you think back to sort of more hunter-gatherer sort of times, you have to remember what that mechanism is in place for. We were supposed to be able to go through periods of fasting where we burned fat. That's why we stored fat, was to burn it in times of scarcity. And all the body was really concerned about was, can you make it long enough through a fast in order to procreate and keep the species going? So when you're fasting and ketones are coming up, your body is turning on these ancient pathways where we decrease inflammation in the body, where we detoxify more effectively, where we naturally raise antioxidants and build more antioxidants to deal with this challenge on our system until we can get past it. So when we trick the body by having a higher fat diet, which starts to promote some ketones in the body, we almost trick it to turn on those systems, but we're not starving all the time. Does that make sense? Okay, when we get into exercise, the key things around the exercise: train in the correct zone. There are different zones. One zone will burn fat, one zone is going to primarily burn sugar. It is okay to do this at certain times, but it has to be done in certain ways. Otherwise, you will set yourself up for chronic injury. If you're finding like, I'm just going from one injury to another, you are in a chronic inflammatory pattern, and you are probably in the wrong zone. You want to avoid the black hole. The black hole is the specific training zone that I'll tell you about where you primarily turn on sugar metabolism and it takes you out of fat burning metabolism. And this is also in the term of chronic cardio. The problem is that when we burn sugar, you have to think of sugar as a bit of a dirty fuel. When we burn sugar, we create a lot more inflammation and oxidative stress. It's like burning coal versus having wind power or solar energy. When we burn fat, that's more like solar energy. It's a very clean fuel. There's less oxidative stress. We actually get more energy from it, and we create more nutrients that protect the mitochondria and allow it to burn more energy and create more energy. And then you need to have ample rest and recovery. So many times, depending on the group I'm talking to, but a lot of times this really gets put to the side and people think training is more is better, and it's the complete opposite. If anything, they've kind of found we actually need to do much less, but we need to do it in a very effective, proper way. And you can get away with doing much less and get better results if you're doing it correctly. So our optimal aerobic exercise zone. Basically this means achieved at a slower, low intensity where fat is the primary fuel. Lots of oxygen's available, and there's minimal stimulation to the anaerobic energy system, which is what burns sugar. Also, when you're in that zone, it naturally puts your nervous system into rest and digest, as opposed to fight or flight when you get too high up in your heart rate. You're primarily burning fat and not glucose. And I'm going to talk about a study. Has anybody heard of this study called the FASTER study? So it's fascinating. I'll share that in a sec here. So we would say don't exceed 65% max heart rate. And I think probably the easiest way to check it would be 180 minus your age, probably minus another 5 beats, would be the max aerobic zone that you would want to stay in. And so what they do is when you're looking down, so if you weren't checking your heart rate, which I'd say check your heart rate when you're doing it because that's the best way to do it. But it's a talk test. You should be able to talk. You should be able to carry on a conversation. It shouldn't be that strenuous. You should be able to breathe through your nose, which also is stimulating for the rest and digest part of the nervous system. And you should finish your workout feeling energetic, good mood, appetite controlled, no soreness, no heavy fatigue. When people do the chronic cardio, they're usually done and they are having sugar cravings. If you finish and you're having sugar cravings, you went into that chronic cardio zone, very likely. You stopped burning fat, you started burning sugar, which set the stage up for more cravings. How they would explain this is it takes about 8 weeks to really build your aerobic zone. So for example, if say I had a loop that I would do that took me 45 minutes to do that loop, staying in my aerobic zone. Okay, so staying in my max aerobic zone, which would be 180 minus my age. So say I'm 45, so say I could not go under 135, or I could not go above 135. I had to stay there. And maybe it takes me 45 minutes to do that loop, staying within that zone. If I keep doing that from week to week, what I should find is that all of a sudden I can do that loop in 40 minutes and staying in that zone. And then a little bit later, 35 minutes I'm cruising through that zone. And maybe I get down to a half hour and I'm staying in my aerobic zone. So what I've done is I've actually increased the amount of work that I can do within that fat burning zone because I've retrained my capacity to manage it. Does that make sense? And when you're doing that, you are spending more time in an anti-inflammatory state. You're spending more time in a fat-burning state. Okay? And you're training your body. You're also spending more time in a rest and digest state. So it's like going for a nice walk after dinner would fall into that sort of category. Okay? So this FASTER study was really neat. What they used to believe was that it was pretty much impossible to burn any more than about 1 gram. They used to believe that the absolute maximum amount of fat that an athlete can burn is upwards of 1 gram per minute when they're exercising. And they did a study where they looked at two groups. One that was on a regular high-carb diet, which is a standard American diet, and one that was on a low-carb diet but a high-fat diet. So 70% fat versus 25% fat, you can see the ratio's difference. And then what they did was, once this group started to do this, they started to become very fat adapted, meaning they were getting very effective at using fat as an energy source, where this is sort of your norm, okay? And so when they believed that it was basically impossible to burn any more than about 1 gram per minute, and most highly trained athletes falling within 0.45 to 0.75 grams per minute of exercise, what they found after this study was remarkable. They actually found that the people that were on the high-fat diet burned up to 1.8 grams of fat per minute, almost double what they actually thought was even physically possible. When you are burning fat as a fuel source, you can go long, long distances without having to constantly refuel. So what they're doing now is there's a lot of ultra marathons and ultra elite athletes that are starting to try and become more keto adapted, they'll call it, or more fat adapted. So they're incorporating a bit more of a ketogenic type of a diet. I'm not necessarily a proponent of a big full-on ketogenic diet. I like intermittent fasting, kind of going in ketosis and then going out of it, going in it, going out of it. I generally think that that's much more manageable and long-term the most healthy thing. But what they're finding is that a lot of these ultra-marathon runners can now go substantially long distances without needing to eat because their body is just taking it from them, right? And it's not uncommon when you look at even fat burning. If you were, they did a study too where they were at, like, that was like the Boston Marathon or something like that, and they actually found that the participants, their body profile was no different than the spectators. They all had about the same amount of percent body fat that was there. And if you've ever been out to a marathon, it's not uncommon to see long distance runners that are carrying a lot of extra weight around the middle. Why is that? You're doing that much exercise and it's still not burning properly. Most of the time that's because they're not fat adapted and they are not effectively burning fat as a fuel source. So the black hole. People love training in the black hole because it feels like you're training hard. It feels like you've finished, you get a bit of an endorphin rush, you're sweating, everything got kind of hot, you feel like you did a body good, right? And you come out, but really, you've probably stayed in that zone the whole time, and it's probably one of the worst things you can do long term. So it's considered vigorous, but not brutal. So it's too slow to make you better, and it's too fast to allow sufficient recovery. So you're in this in-between zone where you're really not getting the benefits you think, but you kind of think you do because it feels like you are. So this is generally the worst place to train because it just starts to stimulate anaerobic energy system, which means you start to burn sugars primarily as a fuel, which you're not wanting to do. You're wanting to burn fat. Everybody that exercises wants to burn fat, not sugars. If you start to burn sugars during exercise, all you're going to do is get more sugar cravings after your exercise, and usually like, okay, I deserve it because I just went and did this, so now I'm going to go have this, right? If you exercise properly, you don't get those kind of cravings after you exercise. And when you're doing your training zone, where you are trying to stay in that max 180 minus your age to stay in your max aerobic zone. When you're doing that, you want to stay in that zone because as soon as you start to go above that in your heart rate, they've shown that you can even trigger you can trigger your body to start using sugar for up to almost 72 hours after that. Just by going up for a short period of time, it can almost trigger the body to go back into a sugar metabolism for up to 72 hours. So this is the realm of chronic cardio. Workouts are just a little bit too long, a little bit too hard, too frequent, not enough rest between them. Stresses the body and puts you in fight or flight. Creates inflammation in the body, prevents the body from burning fat as a primary fuel source, sets the stage for injury and cardiovascular disease. They actually did one study where they looked at marathon runners at the end of a marathon, and they actually took troponin numbers and CRP, measurements for inflammation and cardiovascular risk, and they were almost in the realm of having a heart attack. Now that went down fairly quickly after, because they could recuperate, but it's just to show you the kind of damage that can happen with long-term chronic cardio. And it leaves you feeling tired, exhausted, and no energy after a while. So, what is the solution? What do? You can train for much longer periods in this zone. So if you're doing 180 minus your age regularly and you're staying within that zone and you've trained it, you should be okay. That's not very damaging on your body. It's primarily rest and digest. It should actually be a good thing for you. Unless you've got some kind of a main injury that's tweaking every time you're exercising. But otherwise, you can do that regularly. That should be your bread and butter type of exercise. Then what you might do once in a while to have a hormonal effect that can spike up significant fat-burning hormones like growth hormone and testosterone for a bit is you do little sprints once in a while. Has anybody ever done sprints or higher intensity kind of stuff? So when you do it, if you decide to do it, is first you shouldn't do it unless you're feeling completely okay and injury-free because sprints are challenging on the body. You could do sprints as a physical running sprint, like on a track, or probably easier on the body if you're a swimmer or something would be going and doing like a water running sprint. That would be very low impact on the body. You could even do that a little bit more frequently. But the idea of a sprint would be full out. It should be high intensity for a very short duration of time, like about 10 to 15 seconds. So literally, if I was going to do sprints, it would be I might run 100 yards full out, walk 100 yards, run 100 yards full out, walk 100 yards. I might do 5 sets of that and done. That's it. My whole workout might take me 10 minutes. But that's what they've kind of shown to be pretty much one of the most effective ways to spike that, but more is not better. More just starts to lead you into injury and inflammation. Weight training in a similar way. When you're doing weight training, you are better off to do low reps, much higher weight, and do a short duration of it, and then move on. And you only have to do that once a week even to get pretty maximum benefits. It doesn't have to be this 5 days a week kind of thing. You'd be better off to do this type of exercise most daily, and then once a week do a sprint or do your weight training. Or do weight training once a week and do a sprint every 7 to 10 days. That would be a very effective way to manage chronic injuries and inflammation. And if you're doing that along with a diet that's keeping you fat adapted, you're right on path there. Otherwise, you just constantly be cycling from injury to recovery, from injury to recovery. And I don't know about you, but I've been in that cycle way before. I used to do triathlons for a while and some biathlons and stuff, and I was constantly in injury and out of injury all the time. And that was when I was young. Not that I'm old now, but when I was younger. Like in my 20s where you should be able to get away with everything. Okay, so the take home. In order to minimize injury, decrease disease, and optimize fat loss, with your diet, try to eliminate those 6 foods and get rid of bad fats. Those are cornerstones. Because if you're not doing that, it's kind of like having those, trying to put out fires while you're constantly lighting fires. You're just not going to get very far. And I've seen foods just put a halt on weight loss too for people. Like if it's a food that's creating inflammation and swelling and shutting down and creating issues with blood sugar, you're just going to hit a stalemate with it. Promote fat burning by increasing good fats and incorporating and trying some intermittent fasting. Okay, and see how you feel. It can take 2 to 3 weeks before your body starts to become actually fat adapted. Don't be surprised if you first start and you're kind of like, I don't know, like my energy feels low, I don't feel so good, I'm starving, I'm getting huge sugar cravings. The Bulletproof Coffee makes a big difference with shutting that down. But even still, it takes a little while for your body to get used to it. If it's been burning sugar for years and years and years, you have to give it a little bit of time to get used to primarily burning fats. Aerobic exercise, get into this zone, track yourself. Go for, like if you go for a walk through, say, the conservation area or something like that, like Heber Down or something. Does anybody go down there? Go for a walk. When you start to go up the stairs, check to see where you're at. If your heart rate is starting to get a little bit too high, stop. Slow right down. Don't let it go above that. And then as you're doing it, see if eventually you can trek up the stairs without even thinking about it and you're staying in your aerobic zone. Okay, that's some significant improvement you've made when you start to see results like that. Give yourself, if you can, 8 weeks of training in that zone. Be very aware of your black hole, which is really anything above your 180 minus your heart rate, and rest in between. If you do weight training in sprints, you really shouldn't do weight training in sprints if you don't feel like you want to do some weight training in sprints. If you're kind of dreading going there and doing it, you shouldn't be doing it. Do your 180 minus your heart rate walking for the time being.
And how long are you saying you do that for? Like, what's the time frame for that?
You can go quite a while with that if you want to, if your body feels good, because it's not generally hard on your body. I mean, ultra athletes now will actually spend long chunks of their entire training schedule they will be doing in that. And then they will do very little, because they're saving it all for the race time, where they'll push a little bit harder. But they've built up such a big capacity that they can handle a lot more workload in that range. One of the studies showed that if you do aerobic exercise about 3 times per week, anywhere between about an hour to 2.5 hours per week, I think it was over 40% you decreased chronic disease, or you decreased mortality. It was something along those lines. But it was basically saying about 3 times a week, aerobic exercise between about 1 to 2.5 hours total. I think it was the Copenhagen study.
That 180 is minus your age, or is it minus your heart rate?
Minus your, sorry, that should be 180 minus your age.
Okay. That's what I thought you had said. So,
Yeah.
And then minus 5 beats?
Yeah, so take 180 minus your age, and then take off another probably 5 beats just to be safe.
Okay.
And then you've got a little, like you got 5 beats there to kind of play with a little bit if you're getting close to it.
Okay.
All right, so that takes us to the end of that talk. I think we squeezed it in just under an hour. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask me. Otherwise, thanks so much for coming.
That was awesome, thank you.
Free coffee. So where do you purchase that?
Where I usually get it is I find it at, I used to find it at, I think Whole Foods carries it, and around here would be Healthy Planet. Yeah, it's actually called Bulletproof Coffee. So I ordered in now myself just because I use it regularly. So, but usually you can get it at Healthy Planet. It's not cheap. It's about $20 for a container of it. But when you do it, I would say if you're going to try it, try a round of it. The oils you would do would be grass-fed butter and brain octane. Brain octane is also a bulletproof product. It's
What is that? Is that a powder?
So brain octane is an oil. It's an extraction of coconut oil, specifically just the one fat called caprylic acid that turns into ketones the fastest. So you get a lot more ketones from it than you would from other MCT oil or from coconut oil. I've tried all of them, and I find that that feels best for me.
So it's like a liquid? It's a liquid
Yep,
oil?
it's a liquid, just like coconut oil would be a liquid, but it has no taste.
And it's Healthy Planet as well?
Yeah, they usually carry it.
It's not a supermarket.
Not usually. I usually see it at Healthy Planet. Other health food stores might have it. And I think you could order it from Amazon probably too. Yeah.
So why don't doctors promote this type of an eating program as opposed to
Many do now.
following Canada's Food Guide, for example?
Well, that's a good question. Most of the time because doctors aren't trained in nutrition.
I was just gonna say.
So that's not really their job. They're trained in diagnosing disease and using pharmaceutical meds or surgery to treat it.
So if you said you were gonna be eating like a high-fat diet, no, that's not good for your cholesterol.
It would just because they are not up to date on the literature. That would be it. Because the Surgeon General in the States has actually debunked almost all of that. So it's out there. It's been done. It's just that most people are still behind the times on it. And they don't know how to differentiate fat. Saying a high-fat diet or a low-fat diet means nothing. If you're doing a high-fat diet and you're eating canola oil, that's probably the worst thing you could possibly do for yourself. But if you're having a high beneficial fat diet and a low inflammatory grain and carbohydrate-based diet, that makes a big difference. The best carbohydrates that you can probably eat when you do have carbohydrates would be probably some rice, quinoa, and root vegetables. Have like in its whole form. Have sweet potato, have yam, have squash. Probably not so much regular potato. But that would be probably the best ones to do.
Bill, here you
Dairy, dear.
Butter, ghee.
Gee,
Try coconut cream. Coconut cream's delicious. Try a big dollop of coconut cream in your coffee sometimes. That's super tasty.
Or.
I've made,
no.
and I mean, you just start to get used to different things. You know, it depends on where you live. Like if you're more Caribbean, you would probably grow up having a lot more coconut-based products. That would just be normal, right? So, and I'm not saying that coconut-based products are all of them, but it's just what we get accustomed to. And there's a ton of different ways to do anything. We're just used to a certain way that happens in North America.
Why would I want to eat raw nuts?
Do you like raw nuts?
It's just that I've read they should be raw rather than.
It
roasted.
depends. It's like,
That-
well,
Does it
it's because
change
of how it changes fats.
Okay.
So as soon as you heat fats, they start to go bad. So having raw nuts, if you're not sensitive to nuts, is a beneficial thing to do. A lot of people, though, are sensitive to the little protein markers called lectins on nuts, and if they're raw, they react to them. And as soon as they're cooked slightly, the protein changes, and then they can have them.
They're okay.
Yeah,
So it
like
depends on
myself.
how you react.
I have a hard time with raw nuts. I grew up having tons of allergies as a kid, and like I remember my entire body swelled when they did the skin brace. I was the worst kid he had seen in about 15 years of practice. Nuts were on that list. I couldn't eat any nuts. I'd swell right up and have to go to the hospitals. But now I can actually incorporate them. But it's also, I had a lot of underlying sensitivities that I didn't realize. And once those came out, it was like all of a sudden this whole world opened up that I didn't even know existed.
What about seafood?
Seafood in general is beneficial. The only thing you have to be careful of is the big fish that have too much mercury. You have to be careful of. That's a legitimate concern. Smaller fish, generally pretty healthy. And almost everybody needs more omega-3s, and they're pretty much our best source of omega-3s. Getting omega-3s from a vegetable source is not the same. Don't let anybody ever tell you it is, because it's not. Having it from flaxseed and chia seed is great. I incorporate them into my diet, but they are not the source of omega-3s that I want to get. You'd have to have about a gallon of that to get about a tablespoon of fish oil.
Really?
It just does not convert over. And you get and also they're oxidized much faster. Fish oil is also very volatile, which is why if you take a fish oil supplement, you have to get a very good quality fish oil supplement. Otherwise, you are going to be just taking a rancid oil that is really just giving you free radicals.
So what tells me?
You eventually just go with higher end reputable branches that have third-party lab testing checking things. Like there's a reason why some products are like $5.99 for them and some products are $30 for them. There's completely different quality control. You might not know it. You might talk to other people that know it. You hopefully, if you talk to health professionals that are telling you different things, and they usually are working with certain companies. Most of the time, they carry better stuff. Yeah, like get fish oils more from a health food store probably than like, PharmaSafe.
So what do people come to you for? Like, do you kind of create a diet, different way of eating, or what?
Well, as a naturopathic doctor, I will see people for anything you would see a medical doctor for. But rather than using pharmaceutical drugs and surgery, I'm going to use diet, nutrition, botanical medicines, Chinese medicine, acupuncture, homeopathy, all of the modalities that I use as a naturopathic doctor. This would be part of it if it fit that picture. Yeah. We're often looking at underlying causes for symptoms. People have an array of symptoms, and most of the time there are fundamental issues underlying most of them. It's not to treat each symptom with something different. It's to try how do you correct the bigger underlying problems so that just things start to get better. And most of the time when you correct a lot of that underlying stuff, a lot of the symptoms just start to drift off a little bit. Like you don't have to treat every individual one. If you tried to treat every symptom that you had with supplements, it's really no different than trying to treat them with drugs. There's probably less side effects, but you're still not really treating the body. You're just trying to manage symptoms without making some of the bigger underlying changes that probably need to happen.
I think it's also being aware of your body, knowing
For sure, people nowadays are so not aware of their body, which is why it's good to do things like take foods out, challenge them, see what we feel like. So many people think that normal is optimal, and it's like there is such a difference, and most people have no idea what their bodies can feel like until they've actually done certain things, and it's like, oh my gosh. And then you start to bring it back in, you're like, oh my gosh. That's enlightening when that happens.
Do you eat more raw food than cooked? I'm thinking about, do you talk about the pH balance?
pH balance fits in with when you're decreasing inflammation and you're doing the things for that. Most of the time, you are also that works hand in hand with pH a lot of times too.
Because I
when-
read that if you cook your food, then it turns acidic, the cooked food, as opposed to raw. And then that, of course, also affects, your body, how it functions.
To a point. There's a lot of stuff around the raw food diet that I think has some benefits, but there's a lot of stuff that has a lot of negative parts. You could have, if you were eating a ton of, say, raw leafy greens all the time, like kale and spinach and these things that we think are really healthy. If you're eating tons of those all the time, you have to think, just like how animals grow teeth and claws to protect themselves, plants grow different constituents that protect themselves from being eaten, which actually changes once we cook them. So plants have things like phytic acid and oxalates, which actually bind nutrition and actually don't allow you to absorb it. I had one lady who was completely iron deficient because she ate so much raw spinach all day long, trying to get her iron, and she had so much phytic acid from it, it was just binding everything up.
She would have been better off to cook than.
She would have been absolutely better off to cook it. Most times when you cook it, so I also think you have to, it's a bigger story, but it's like raw foods I think work also seasonally. So raw foods naturally are going to make more sense in probably summertime. Summertime, I grew up in the Okanagan Valley, so in BC. So I would go and pick apples and peaches and cherries in the summertime. We had a garden in the backyard, we go and pick whatever. But after summertime, that starts to kind of whittle out and you don't really have access to it. So wintertime, we're not designed to eat a bunch of raw foods living in Toronto. We should be eating stews, soups, crock-pot types of meals, warming foods to balance the cold energy, which is probably what your body naturally craves more in the wintertime. As soon as spring hits, I'm wanting more cleansing types of foods. I literally, the day hits where the temperature changes, I'm like, I feel like salad. Where I'm like, I know I don't feel like grilled vegetables now, or I feel like salad. And that's sort of what I start to move towards. So that also plays into our ability to manage it. There's a energetic, warming, cooling, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic sort of way of looking at foods too that plays into stuff for people.
Maybe some balance.
Yeah. And you have to constantly self-check to see what works for you. I can even give you some ideas and some templates to start with, but ultimately, I think I said another one, when we look at if we are balancing our bodies with foods effectively and we're hormonally balanced, think of what you chew affects you. CHEW being an acronym for cravings, hunger, energy, weight. When you're eating for a way that balances your body, you should not be getting cravings. You should not get hungry for several hours after you eat. You should not have energy spikes and crashes, and you should be able to manage your weight fairly effectively. Everything is on track when those things are working.
Thank you very
All right.
much. If anyone has more questions, I found it very, very